Good afternoon and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Jane Harman. I am the new president and CEO, having served previously in the United States Congress for 9 terms. According to many of my former colleagues, I was lucky to escape, and I am absolutely thrilled to take on this assignment. It is a great honor for us this afternoon that Brazil's Minister of External Relations, that might be known as Foreign Minister to some of us, Aguiar Patriota, will make his first public speech about President Dilma Rousseff's foreign policy here at the Wilson Center. As ambassador to Washington from 2007 to 2009, Minister Patriota participated frequently in our events. He's been greeting people in the hallways. He may know more people than I do here. And a little secret, if he ever gets tired of his job, we'd love him to join us. When Hala Esfandiari, now the director of our Middle East program, was arrested by the Iranian regime, Ambassador Patriota was one of the diplomats who responded to Lee Hamilton, my predecessor's plea for help. After Hala was freed, Ambassador Patriota came here to see her and later invited her for dinner at the Brazilian embassy. Ambassador Patriota's presence and support was instrumental in the Brazil Institute's becoming the primary place in Washington for dialogue about public policy issues relevant to Brazil and Brazil-U.S. Relations. Of course, Paulo Sotero also plays an ongoing role in making this institute at the Wilson Center so prestigious. In 2009, Minister Patriota hosted a lunch of the Wilson Center Board of Trustees at the embassy residence. And now he returns to Washington on an important mission for his country to follow up on the relationship cultivated by President Obama and a high-level U.S. delegation in Brazil last month. During that visit, President Obama made plain his view that it is time for the U.S. and Brazil to have a relationship on par with that of China and India. New initiatives were launched on economic and financial dialogue, strategic energy cooperation, education, innovation, and infrastructure. Both presidents stressed the importance of innovative economies for sustainable growth. No one has missed the fact that the BRIC group of emerging powers is growing rapidly in political and economic influence. Earlier this week, the BRICS released a statement that it is time to reform our international financial institutions to reflect the current role of developing countries in the global economy. I would just add my 2 cents that if this doesn't happen, a lot of the emerged powers may soon be left behind. During President Obama's trip to Brazil, he established a new global partnership dialogue with Brazil. Ambassador Minister Patriota is here to lead the dialogue with Secretary Hillary Clinton and her teams. President Rousseff is expected to visit Washington later this year, and hopefully she will also be in New York for a gathering hosted by the Wilson Center. Maybe that's a secret. Maybe it's classified, so Paulo looks uncomfortable. Never mind. We hope that will happen. It was a secret. Oops. She and Minister Patriota are action-oriented, and her visit should assure continued and increasing momentum in bilateral engagement. It is a privilege to welcome such a distinguished Brazilian diplomat and public servant to the Wilson Center. Before I do, I want to acknowledge the presence of other diplomats in our audience today, including Ambassadors Mauro Vieira, who is the Brazilian ambassador to the U.S., Tom Shannon, our ambassador to Brazil. I also want to recognize Tom Pickering, hiding in the back, or did he move to the front? Former Undersecretary of State and a dear friend, and the chair of the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute Advisory Board, my old friend and a former ambassador to Brazil, Tony Harrington. Where's Tony? Tony's right in the middle on the, oh, there he is. Okay, and let me note that Minister Patriota's exceptional service in prior times includes Deputy Foreign Minister, Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, Chief of Staff to the Foreign Minister, and posts at the United Nations, the WTO, Caracas, and Beijing, and his future occupation will be as one of the leaders of the Wilson Center. Please welcome Minister Patriota to the Wilson Center to share with us highlights of of foreign policy and engagement under President Rousseff of Brazil. Thank you, Mr. Minister, for coming here.
Well, thank you very much for your very comprehensive introduction. And let me start by saying that I'm very pleased to be back in Washington, see so many friendly faces, starting with Tony Harrington, former ambassador to Brazil, Paulo Sotero from the Brazil Institute. Congratulate yourself, Madam Harman, on your assumption of the Woodrow Wilson Institute. It's a great institution. I was here many times as ambassador, and I met many very, very distinguished thinkers and political scientists who became my friends subsequently during discussions that we had here. Thank Ambassador Mauro Vieira for his presence, and I see many colleagues from the Brazilian diplomatic community here in Washington as well as American friends. And I see this really as an opportunity to have a conversation among friends, even though the press is here, so we have to be a little bit vigilant. But on what these first few months of a new administration under President Dilma Rousseff, our first female president, it's quite an extraordinary accomplishment in many ways for Brazil and for our region. But maybe the first thought I would share with you is that a country will obviously have much more capital to invest in foreign policy if it is managing its domestic agenda in ways that are producing results. And I think this is one of the fundamental ideas to bear in mind when one looks at Brazil's foreign policy and Brazil's articulation of its relationships around the world in the past several years, the past decade, and continue into this administration. Brazil grew at high rates over the past decade, last year 7.5%. The quantitative of course, statistics are very impressive. The reserves that have reached $300 billion, increase in per capita income, et cetera. But I think there's a qualitative improvement also. Well, first of all, the reduction in poverty, the millions of Brazilians that were brought into the middle class, the millions of Brazilians that escaped extreme poverty, not to minimize the fact that there's still Brazilians living in extreme poverty, but a number that is manageable, and it actually has become imaginable that even within this administration's period in office, or perhaps a little more, we will have eliminated or come very close to eliminating extreme poverty in Brazil, which is something that would have seemed unimaginable even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So there's much to say about the economy, economic growth with social progress, with reduction of poverty, with increased opportunity. The figures on employment, I think, are very eloquent also. When one looks at the very challenging situations that this country and European economies are undergoing at present, and one looks at the situation in Brazil, where employment fell to 6.4 last April, 6.4%. So under the world average for unemployment, which is also quite unprecedented for Brazil. When one looks at these figures and one also takes into account the awareness regarding, for example, the environmental dimension of things, reduction in deforestation, the very ambitious targets that have been adopted to reduce CO2 emissions. When one looks at the very strong democratic roots that Brazil has demonstrated in the past decades, I would say, alternating between political parties, different emphasis in public policy, but nevertheless, through a very, I think, comparatively harmonious process where, in fact, it's curious, but on many policy issues, you have something close to a national consensus in Brazil. You could even describe Brazil as a less polarized society than the United States in some respects, certainly when it comes to environmental issues. When we took to Copenhagen, unilaterally determined targets of reducing CO2 emissions between 36 and 39% based on business as usual growth on up to 2020, these targets in a few months became enshrined into national legislation with a comparatively quick domestic debate. Now, that would be hard to imagine in many other countries, and certainly in this country from where I'm speaking right now. So, democratic governance, convergence between the extremes of the political spectrum. Human rights also, I think human rights becoming increasingly important. Sometimes the press or observers like to point out that President Dilma Rousseff is particularly keen in upholding human rights. But I think it's very important to bear in mind a longer-term perspective. First of all, when you reduce poverty, when you reduce extreme poverty and bring people into the middle class, you are promoting human rights. You're contributing to human dignity, and you're empowering people for them to exercise their political, civilian rights and other rights. When you take up an agenda which is fundamental in Brazil, such as the racial equality agenda, and this was done in a more straightforward manner in the past years than ever before in our history by the creation of a ministerial position that deals with the promotion of racial equality. I think you're also signaling very strong emphasis on human rights. Similarly, other agencies were created to promote gender equality, and actually one could argue that this has worked so well that we have now a female president. But nevertheless, I think President Dilma Rousseff brings into office a personal history that speaks for itself. Someone who was imprisoned because of her beliefs, belief in pluralism, belief in upholding a certain view of economic and social progress, which at the time was considered a threat to stability. And for this, she was put into prison and tortured. And of course, this is not something that one forgets easily. And she does bring into office a strong desire to build upon the many important steps that have been taken and the progress reached over the past few years, and take Brazil into a new chapter, a society that can be largely described as a, well, predominantly middle-class society, which we are already, one where citizens can fully exercise their rights, including political rights and other rights, and where justice works for all. In short, a more egalitarian society in a country and a part of the world that has for long been known and characterized and recognized as being among the most unequal in the world. So we are bridging that gap very quickly. And, well, coming back to my initial point, I think this opens up an entirely new perspective for engaging with the rest of the world. When one looks at the rest of the world, it's a world that is in very quick transformation. And, of course, the upheaval in the Arab world this year is maybe one of the most eloquent examples of that. But even beyond looking at the Arab world, what we examine is a more multipolar international configuration. Recently, President Obama made a speech in London where he was talking about US and European leadership, and he felt the need to remind the international community, as it had forgotten, that other actors are also important, including Brazil, India, China, and there are, of course, more, and but not an unlimited number that have the kind of capacity to influence decisions and to reach out at a global level. It's a world of opportunity, and a world also where Brazil, I think, maybe with India, we share this common trait among the emerging powers. It's the first time in our history, really, that we can say that we have full global outreach. Just some quantitative facts. For the first time, we have diplomatic relations with every single country in the world, and this is only since 2010. We are among the countries in the world with the largest number of embassies anywhere. In Africa, we're number 7, for example, in number of embassies. Brasilia has become quite a different capital than it was when I moved there as a young diplomat in the early 1980s, where you had a handful of embassies. Today, there are more than 130. There's even an embassy from Fiji, from the Fiji Islands in Brazil, which demonstrates that even in the Pacific Islands, there are bilateral issues that we deal with, and as well as many others, including environmental ones. Now, I think if one looks at the new multipolar configuration, there are certain things that one can say about it besides the fact that Brazil and India are relatively newcomers to this true global outreach arena. First of all, the United States remains unquestionably the number one military economic power, very strong, with a GDP several times bigger than the number two. And certainly, even as Brazil goes up the scale in terms of GDP weight, at the seventh economy in the world today and perhaps fifth in 10 years, some say before, some say a little bit after, the distance is still great between the kind of wealth that one can contemplate in a country like the United States or a developed European country and some of the emerging countries. Besides this, let's say, stronger presence of one of the poles, you could argue also that China is quickly becoming a number two that is fast ahead of most of the others in terms of economic, demographic, military presence. Of course, China and Russia, having already been world powers before, they bring a different mnemonic content into their present international situation. But there are certain traits that I think distinguish Brazil from any of these other poles. One of them is the fact that we are denuclearized, not only because our firm belief in diplomacy, our difficulty with military solutions to international peace and security issues, and a sense that we would like to preserve our part of the world free from weapons of mass destruction. And we have acted upon this. We have acted upon this by enshrining in our Constitution a ban on the development of nuclear power for other than peaceful purposes. We have joined treaties regionally, and the Tlatelolco Treaty, of course, foremost, but also through Mercosur, through UNASUR, in ensuring that our part of the world remains free from those weapons. Not only this is a singular trait, perhaps it sets us aside from the other poles that are emerging or that have already emerged, including one tends to overlook Europe, but Europe, as European Union, is certainly a very strong economic power, and many of its individual members still among the strongest economic and military powers in the world, certainly Britain, France, Germany, to name but three. The fact that we have essentially cooperative and peaceful relations with all our neighbors. It may seem obvious to people who deal mostly with Latin America, but if you place us in a world, global context, it's quite unusual because most of the other powers have stressful relations, difficulties, tensions, either inside their own territory due to ethnic differences and religious minorities and so on, or because of other geopolitical and historic situations. Well, this is not the case in South America for sure. South America can also be described today as the second fastest growing region in the world, if you look at the average growth rates. And it has another important characteristic, is that it's a democratic region. All governments are democratically elected. All governments are demonstrating, with varying degrees, a capacity to confront the challenge of inequality and trying to find, through autonomous experimentation, the road to sustainable development, high levels of growth with social inclusion, and increasingly also with the environmental awareness. If you put all this together, I believe that Brazil is quite uniquely placed today to participate actively in the shaping of a new world order, more multipolar, more democratic, more in tune with today's challenges in any of the key sectors that we need to coordinate internationally, whether it's economy and finance, and we can do this through the G20 and other mechanisms, whether it's trade, with our active participation through the WTO G20. We have also contributed to modernize and in many ways even revolutionized the working methods of the old GATT and today's WTO, whether it's the environmental agenda, and certainly when one looks at Copenhagen and Cancun, it's very clear. We have here with us our environmental negotiator ambassador, Luis Alberto Figueiredo Machado, who was at both conferences, and I think it would be, if one asks any of the participants in those two conferences, they would signal that Brazil was certainly an important or even a key actor in those discussions. And I believe also more and more, although this is a field where global governance has yet to experience the kind of aggiornamento or modernization that one has found in other areas, in the peace and security agenda. Along with Japan, as you know, Brazil is a country with the longest serving time at the Security Council as a non-permanent member. 11 stints, 11 two-year stints. So, you know, if one thinks of a 60-year period, that's almost 1/3 of the Security Council's existence. And certainly in the post-Cold War period, very frequent and very active and often very creative participation in the Security Council, with, I think, a very strong voice for diplomacy, for peaceful solution to challenges in this area, and a also very independent view of where the solutions may lie, a very independent view which comes from a capacity that I think we have developed. Maybe it's something that is deeply ingrained in our own DNA, a capacity to keep a dialogue with countries of very different cultural backgrounds, religious, ethnic, level of development, etc. Well, you know, essentially what I've done up to now is a little bit of a commercial about Brazil, and I think many of you who follow Brazil closely are aware of these strengths. But I don't want to minimize the challenges either, and I see today almost a national consensus emerging on where some of these challenges are. We're very proud of the fact that we are an economy with a very clean energy matrix. The biofuels agenda, the new oil finds make us energy self-sufficient. More than 45% of our energy is from renewable sources. We're also very proud of all the advances in agriculture. We have what is arguably the most advanced agricultural research institute for tropical agriculture in Embrapa, and this has represented a tremendous gain in productivity and in a capacity also to farm into areas of the country that were previously considered unfit for agriculture. But when we look at our industrial capacity, I think there's a growing awareness that we need to take strong measures to enhance our competitiveness. There's unease over the large number of Asian imports in consumer goods. Many of the low-budget electronic products that come from Asia seem to be disrupting or at least creating a sense of insecurity in parts of the private sector. There is also a sense, for example, that in our trade relationship with the United States, their growing trade deficit represents a certain threat also to a sustainable trading pattern, and this also has to do with industrial competitiveness. There is a sense that infrastructure is a challenge in Brazil. We are preparing for the Soccer World Cup 2014, the Olympic Games 2016, Rio +20, which will be a very important conference next year, 20 years after the Rio conference on the environment and development. And we are, of course, I think I'll come back to this because this is going to be a very significant venue for us to promote a debate on new paradigms of development, speaking about green economy, reduction of poverty, fully incorporating the environmental side of things into our new thinking on development. But there's a sense that our airports, our roads, our ports need to be modernized at a very accelerated pace. And while I believe that the government of Dilma Rousseff is working very actively to overcome these challenges, this is a point that could represent to some degree, and is already represented to some degree, a glut in our development. Education, it would be in anyone's agenda when one speaks of challenges. Basic primary education, university education. There is a shortage of manpower in some of the more advanced engineering and scientific areas, which explains why so much emphasis is being put by President Dilma in her discussions with especially more developed partners like the United States, some European countries, China, countries in the region also, in developing educational programs. We would like to open up at least 75,000 grants for students at the graduate, postgraduate level to study abroad in fields of science, engineering, mathematics especially, between now and 2014. So, of course, progress in competitiveness, scientific progress, innovation are all linked to the level of education, and we are keenly aware that more has to be done if we can remain competitive. Actually, it's quite interesting because when President Obama, I just say this as an aside, met with President Dilma Rousseff in March, one of her first remarks was to say, I read your State of the Union address, and many of the concerns we have in Brazil seem to be also present in your own concerns. I think the word innovation was mentioned, I don't know, at least 15 times in that speech as one of the keys to the future and the industrial progress here in the United States as well. There are other issues that I could include in the column of the challenges. Urban violence, which has been reducing, but still a concern in the largest cities in Brazil. In fact, the richest cities in Brazil are often the prey to the highest levels of crime, which speaks again of the inequality issue. Extreme wealth living side by side with extreme poverty and creating this social tension. Drug trafficking in Latin America, we are comparatively, let's say, protected from some of the more violent patterns that one observes south of the border of the United States up to Central America. But we need to be very vigilant if we want to protect and to preserve South America, as we would like to do as a continent for democracy, economic growth, social progress, and essentially peace. I think it has the full potential to be an example for peace, and however you define it, peace must include development, must include today also increasingly respect for human rights, respect for the environment. So these are the important challenges we face, and while we look at our strengths and our weaknesses in engaging with the outside world, what I think President Dilma Rousseff brings to the office is a blend of extreme pragmatism and realism, and this can be seen in the emphasis that she's been placing in very concrete results in all of her bilateral meetings. There have been quite a few. There was President Obama's visit in March. There was President Dilma's visit to Beijing in April, and subsequently she attended a BRICS summit in the island of Hainan in the south of China. There have been many visitors to Brazil from countries as diverse as East Timor to Germany to Sweden, but a leitmotif or a common denominator in most of the discussions has been looking at trade figures, looking at ways to enhance trade, investment, to increase opportunity for scientific, technological exchange, look at the innovation agenda, look at the education agenda. In addition to this pragmatic or realistic or result-oriented streak that is one of her defining traits. She also brings a strong sense of idealism into this position. And this idealism, I think, is translated in the value placed on democratic governance, the value placed on development with social justice, the value placed on human rights, and also on sustainable development, on respect for the environment. This is the blend that has been shaping many of the bilateral discussions. But I think a presentation of what we are trying to accomplish would be incomplete without a reference to the multilateral sphere and to the way we would like to engage internationally in this more multipolar world that I tried to summarize before. Of course, we are trying to create a capacity for strong partnerships with all the poles. There's a very, a traditionally very developed agenda with the United States that we are trying to reconfigure, to reshape, and bring to a new level, not only of trust in terms of political dialogue, but also of cooperation. And there have been important agreements signed recently, including in the defense area. There have been new fields that we have opened, for example, in the exchange of information and experience and in coordination on the promotion of racial equality, to mention another issue. Promotion of gender equality also, under the leadership of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. An agreement was reached last year for an agenda on this front. And actually, very interestingly, we are trying to combine science and gender equality by promoting a program of exchange between women scientists in the two countries. But we would not like to partake or to participate in a world that is more multipolar by bringing to the restricted groups that we may participate in, whether it's the G20, whether it's a reformed Security Council, whether these are the restricted groups that deal with the environment or with trade, bringing a sense that, okay, now that we can be part of the elite group, this is an accomplished objective, and we can look at how to shape the future of the world from this perspective. I think this would be a serious mistake, because we've been outside looking in for most of our history, and we know what it feels like to be outside looking in. And this is what I think creates a special sensitivity to keep in touch with what some people would call the G172, all the UN members who are not members of G20. And unless we do this, I think we run the risk of isolating ourselves from very valid aspirations that cannot be adequately translated or articulated by any small group. And in fact, I don't think any country, small as it may be, would be ready to completely outsource their agenda to any representative wherever, whatever the topic may be. So you will see Brazil also working very hard to enhance its outreach with smaller countries or with less developed countries, wherever they may be. You will see us building upon what was a very significant outreach movement during the Lula government, in particular towards Africa, towards the Middle East, towards countries in Asia, towards the new members of the international community in the former Yugoslavia, the former Soviet Union, and developing individual specific agendas with all these partners, as well as trying to create some new coalitions. Some of them I am very engaged in trying to keep alive, and in fact they are very solid, and they have kind of generated their own dynamics. IBSA is one of them, the trilateral group that brings together India, Brazil, and South Africa, three large multi-ethnic democracies from the developing world. There is the South America Arab World Summit. I was recently in Cairo speaking to the Arab League Secretary General. I think he actually is leaving his job tomorrow. Amr Moussa, known to many of you, and the current foreign minister, who will become the Arab League Secretary General, Nabil El Arabi, and they were saying how they had felt over the past years that Brazil extended its hand to the Arab world. Not necessary to do this under the pressure of the current changes taking place in that part of the world, because this South America Arab World Summit that began in 2005 with its first edition in Brasilia created a framework for cooperation on economic and trade matters, on culture, on, in fact, even discovering that there was a much deeper cultural link between the two worlds than was previously imagined. In every country in South America, you will find a sizable Lebanese, Syrian community, as well as Jewish and other many minorities. But there had never been an organized dialogue between these communities. This is something that is now taking place under the sign of very important developments in the Arab world that I think will signal more democracy, more social justice, more opportunity for the young population in those countries. There's also been a South America-Africa mechanism. There's been the BRICS summits themselves that have been very interesting, and you mentioned those in your introduction. So, in summary, a very active, engaged foreign policy that will look at the strongest poles in the system, that will try to create an environment of cooperative multipolarity. Sometimes I speak of benign multipolarity. You know, there could be many other scenarios. There could be competitive or a multipolarity where communication breaks down. But this is not what we're about. We want to ensure that the coming decades are ones where we can concentrate on creating more dignified, more prosperous societies, more dignity for the individual, and certainly better opportunity for those in the less developed parts of the world. And the global outreach that I mentioned across regions, as well as a very, very strong commitment to multilateralism. And I'll end by saying that we are very transformational when it comes to multilateralism as compared to some other members of the multipolar environment that we live in. And we would like to see more representative mechanisms, not only for financial and economic cooperation, for trade, but also for peace and security, for the environment, and for all the other global issues where I think the entire international community has a stake in, and certainly you will not see Brazil shying away from these responsibilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Patriota, for that presentation, always thoughtful and illuminating as usual. And let me add to Jane Harman's comments our appreciation for your support in the past and your ongoing support of the Wilson Center and the role that the Brazil Institute plays here. Glad to have you back in Washington. You may have thought that your plane stopped in Fortaleza in midsummer when the weather hit you, but I had the privilege of joining and leading the business delegation for President Obama's very successful visit in March, and in that role I could see what always happens around presidential visits. Hopefully they turn out very well, as this one did, but a lot of work by people like foreign ministers and ambassadors to make it happen. So we appreciate all you did for that. We look forward to President Rousseff's visit, and as you said, she's a woman of action, as you are a man of action, so we look forward to an invigorated bilateral relationship going forward. The minister is available to carry on the discussion for 15 to 20 minutes, so welcome a few questions from those of you who are assembled here.
I would just ask for you to identify yourselves before you ask questions that should be in the form of questions and should be brief. Ch- Chad Evans there.
Minister, thank you so much for your comments. One quick question. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the priorities between Brazil and the United States to meet some global grand challenges, the need to double food production in 50 years, the need to meet a rising demand for energy. Any thoughts you might have on issues like that would be most appreciated. Thanks.
Chad Evans is with the Council on Competitiveness, that is with the Movimento Brasil Competitivo, so our partners. Do you want to answer each question?
You can jot down a few questions.
Yes,
3 or 4.
so, Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly Myman with McClarty Associates. Thank you, Paulo, and thank you, Minister, for your comments. I was wondering if you could comment briefly on the Brazil relationship with Mercosur and specifically with Argentina. A number of the companies that have been investing over the years in Brazil, specifically in the industrial sector, have done so with a view not just towards serving Brazil and particularly now the growing Brazilian middle class, but also Mercosur. And that's been an area of a bit of challenge of late, and would welcome your comments. Thank you.
Steve Schwartzman from Environmental Defense.
Thank you. You mentioned Brazil's remarkable achievements in reducing deforestation and its landmark climate change legislation, which I think has really justifiably earned Brazil a position of global leadership on the environment and sustainable development. Just last week, the Brazilian House of Representatives passed legislation that would, by many accounts, radically weaken Brazil's forestry code. Many, including the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, the Society for the Promotion of Science, and 10 former environment ministers are quite concerned about the implications of this legislation. And the environment ministry itself has said that reported or increases in deforestation this year probably in part result from the expectation of an amnesty for deforestation. Can you comment on the prospects for this legislation and its potential implications for Brazil's hosting of the Rio Plus 20 meeting?
Do you want to one more, or do you want to?
I think 3 is good
Okay,
for the
go
time
ahead.
being. On food production, food security, and energy, Brazil and the United States are obvious leaders worldwide on this front. In fact, the United States is #1 agricultural producer in many of the goods that Brazil is either becoming #1 or is #2, and there's a soya production, for example, is one example. On the energy front, we are 2 of the biggest biofuel producers worldwide, in addition to having a developed oil industry. Here in the U.S., there's more of a controversy over drilling than in Brazil at this moment. But certainly these advantages or comparative advantages that we have are not being overlooked. And if you look at the joint communique that was adopted during President Obama's visit to Brasilia, you will find chapters on both of the topics, and we will be discussing them here in Washington during this global partnership meeting with the Secretary of State as well. What may be a novelty or a development that reflects the relative position of Brazil and the U.S., especially Brazil today as the 7th economy and a more prosperous economy than we had been in previous decades, is also the interest in working with third countries. So there's a memorandum on biofuels cooperation that looks at how to do trilateral cooperation with very vulnerable economies from the point of view of energy security in Central America. Haiti is an example, but El Salvador, Honduras, others, and we're looking at Africa also, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau. This will be part of the agenda today and tomorrow. When it comes to food security, the same applies. We are looking at projects in places like Mozambique, for example. There are others. Haiti, of course, needs all the help it can get, and this is one country where we've demonstrated, Brazil and the United States, a capacity to work together and to join forces in ensuring that this vicious cycle of instability, chronic violence that has marked Haiti's history for most of its time as an independent nation can be replaced by more democratic governance and better opportunities for economically and socially for its population. So this is maybe one of the more exciting areas where Brazil and the U.S. are joining hands to look at how they can improve energy and food security worldwide. And I might take this opportunity to mention something I should have mentioned before, that Brazil has an excellent candidate to the FAO Director General position, Food and Agriculture Organization, in Rome. Elections will take place on 26th of June. And the man who we have placed as our candidate is no one less than the one who conceived the Zero Hunger program in Brazil that brought millions out of poverty and has ensured that Brazilians are not prey to malnutrition, and because in fact we are a country that can feed itself. That the challenges we have to overcome very often are ones that have to do with income distribution, access to food, and other challenges. And I believe that he will bring into the position, I think he's at present perhaps the front runner, extraordinary expertise that can be put at the service, especially of countries that have serious situations as regards food security in Africa and Latin America, some parts still in particular. Mercosul, there are, of course, situations that require attention, and there has been quite a bit of publicity about the current situation on the licensing practices in Argentina, and Brazil has now adopted some licensing practices also that in fact are adopted erga omnes, as they say at the WTO, not to affect Argentina in particular, but that are affecting Argentina to a significant extent. But I think the important thing here is not to let that overshadow the extraordinary success story that Mercosul is. If you look at the 4 Mercosul economies in 2010, they grew by 8% on average. One of the members grew by 15%, Paraguay, and this is something that most people are not even aware of. It was the second largest, fastest growing economy in the world in 2010 after Qatar. Of course, starting from a relatively low base, but still a fantastic demonstration of vitality and dynamism in the southern cone economies of South America. And this has been extremely beneficial, I think, to the 4 countries. The Brazilian private sector, in particular, has benefited greatly. We enjoy a significant trade surplus with Argentina, $5 billion US dollars in trade surplus. The quality of trade with our neighborhood is also very advantageous. We export a high proportion of high value-added goods, industrial goods. There's a debate in the Brazilian press and public opinion about the kind of relationship we have with China, for example. In spite of a robust trade surplus, close to 90% of our exports to China are concentrated in 3 products: soya, iron ore, and oil. So commodities, essentially, whereas we import manufactured goods. But this is not the case with Latin America. So if you look at the big picture, economically, trade-wise, Mercosul is an extraordinary success story. I was very struck, and I still am, by the increasing interest that Mercosul is generating internationally. At the last summit meeting in Foz do Iguaçu, the border between Paraguay and Brazil, you had the Australian foreign minister participating. You had the closest economic advisor to the Prime Minister of Turkey participating. You had participants from practically every corner of the world, and this is something that we witnessed. I was just in Japan after the terrible earthquake, and as you all know, there's a significant Brazilian community living in Japan. And in my discussions with the Japanese foreign minister, he was saying that they wanted to be invited to the next Mercosur summit. So I think these are indications of how healthy and robust Mercosur is. Of course, when we look at our vicinity, we look at Mercosur, but we also look at UNASUR, the new framework for cooperation among all of South American countries that now enjoy a officially entered into force treaty. This was only March of this year that it came into force. Two important countries have yet to ratify it, and you know that one of them is my own, and Paraguay. But this does not prevent us from working in this context already on trade issues, economic issues, political defense, combating illicit crime and drug trafficking, among many others. And these are all mechanisms that I think contribute to a sense of greater predictability in the relationship between Brazil and its neighbors, which is not to say that there will not be episodes of that, you know, that require some diplomacy. They have to call the diplomats on duty to try to find a way out. This is something that the U.S. is very accustomed to in its relations with Canada or with Mexico or the European countries and their relations among themselves. So it's a sign of strong, enhanced trade relations rather than the opposite. This is how I would portray it. On deforestation and the forest legislation, how can that impact on Rio Plus 20? Well, this will not impact on some of the characteristics that I mentioned before. Brazil will still be, by any standard, the country of its level of GDP or among the largest economies in the world, the one with by far the cleanest energy matrix. Our renewable mix into the energy in Brazil is 46%. I understand that OECD average is something under 10% or close to 10%. So extraordinary, very eloquent distance there. A leader in biofuels and a country that has enacted legislation that is much more ambitious than that which you may find, well, in highly developed places such as the United States. So what the debate on the forest code involves is a democratic process, which often democracy delays the more ambitious agendas by some time. There are conflicting interests at play here. But I am a strong believer in the capacity of the Brazilian political system and society in overcoming these differences. It would have been unthinkable 10 years ago for Brazil to have presented as ambitious a set of targets as we did at the Copenhagen conference for reducing CO2 emissions. Based on that example, I think that the relatively minor items on the forest code that have generated controversy, and this is the opinion of the environment minister herself, Isabel Teixeira, with whom I work very closely, do not compromise or put into jeopardy the overall advance which the legislation represents.
One more round. Corey, Jorge Heine, and Craig Kelly. And then, yeah, you can start there and then come here, and then we go there.
I'm Jorge Heine, public policy scholar at the Latin American program of the Wilson Center. Minister, President Zelaya returned to Honduras this past weekend after 2 years of his ouster. Many people would say that the way the Honduras crisis was ultimately resolved in 2009 was not the best, and that it left a bit of aftertaste in the region and elsewhere. Brazil, of course, had its own position on it. And I wonder if you could reflect a bit on where Brazil stands today on the situation in Honduras, and more generally, how we can avoid similar situations in the future that had such a negative effect on inter-American relations.
Michael here, Corey Sue here, right?
Thank you. My name's Corey Sumoris. I'm a master's candidate at the Elliott School in Latin American Studies, and I was in Paulo's class last semester.
So ask a intelligent question.
Well, okay. Well, I'm in a public
exposed here.
diplomacy class this semester, and it's been said that today diplomacy is increasingly becoming public diplomacy. Do you differentiate between the two, and what does the Itamaraty do to engage with civil society effectively to get out of the embassy, if you will, and into the streets? And I know you mentioned educational exchanges. Are there any issues that you think public diplomacy would be most effective in tackling?
Ambassador.
That was
great
an intelligent question.
Here's your
Group, if you could say a couple of words, please, about Brazil's bilateral diplomatic as well as trade and investment relationship with India, please.
Excuse me, with India.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, starting with Honduras, the events that unfolded in the past few weeks and that climax with the return of former President Zelaya to Tegucigalpa last Saturday, I think are a big victory for democracy in Latin America and in the world. Brazil was present at this occasion. The diplomatic advisor to President Dilma Rousseff, Professor Marco Aurelio Garcia, was in Tegucigalpa and participated in a luncheon that I think had also the foreign ministers of Venezuela and Colombia, to whom our recognition goes for their very inspiring work in this regard. And I think one of the best stories coming out of South America these days is the way in which Colombia has patched things up with its two neighbors, Venezuela and Ecuador, and established an essentially positive agenda with both countries, to the point where they can now, Caracas and Bogota, work together to tackle one of the most challenging situations politically that had arisen with the ouster in a military coup of former President Zelaya. So we are ready to engage with Honduras as a full member of the community of nations. This is the spirit in which Professor Marco Aurelio participated in the events last Saturday. He had bilateral discussions with the current president, Pepe Lobo, who indicated a strong desire to make up for lost time and to establish a strong agenda of cooperation with Brazil. Honduras has great challenges, very poor country, I think among the three poorest countries in the Americas, along with Haiti and Nicaragua. Very serious security issues, crime, I think one of the highest rates of deaths, violent death in the world and in the region. But also strong assets, and we would like to start working on a program of cooperation very soon. How to avoid other situations rising such as this? Well, first of all, I think the example that was given by countries in the region in not accepting the fait accompli of the military coup was a very good stance, and one that demonstrated that there is no tolerance today in Latin America for this kind of adventurism that was quite common and quite associated with the region in previous decades. But you might also look elsewhere to see how committed countries in the region are to democracy today. There's a lively debate, for example, within a new mechanism being created, which is CELAC. Oh, as I speak of CELAC, Secretary General of OAS just walked in, and I was speaking of Honduras, so good to see Jose Miguel. Within the CELAC that will come into force in July, Venezuela is hosting the summit, and it is a grouping that brings together all the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean and tries to bring together the different integration processes that are taking place in the region. You have CARICOM, you have the SICA, bringing together the Central American countries, you have Mercosur, you have the ALBA, you have UNASUR. They will all converge in this new forum. Will remain, I think, a relatively flexible forum without too much of an institutional or institutionalized framework. But there's a very lively debate on a democratic clause, how this democratic clause should be drafted. And there are a number of examples to draw from. There's the Democratic Charter from the OAS. There's the democratic clause that was negotiated in the Iberian American Summit recently after coup attempts in Ecuador that very gladly did not go forward. There is the democratic clause in Mercosur. So very clearly, countries in the region are not ready to give up on the political accomplishments of the past decades that have been achieved through, I think, very serious and often violent struggle and suffering. There's another question about public diplomacy. It's interesting. Often in the United States, this question is asked, and it's, to me, a bit of an American question, because here public diplomacy is so important. And in a place like Brazil, when I entered the Foreign Service, for example, in the 80s and even the 90s, it was not really expected that you should interact regularly with the academic world or even the press, for that matter, or civil society or Congress. But this is no longer the case. And I personally believe that as Brazil becomes more engaged in its own region, more active internationally, becomes a global player to some extent, we need to keep the population and different sectors of society well informed of what the initiatives are, what the spirit in which they are undertaken is, and where we are heading. So, this might explain why I spent 3 hours recently at our Senate Foreign Relations Committee being asked a number of questions on a variety of topics. We have annual encounters with academia that are organized by a kind of foundation that's linked to the Foreign Ministry, FUNAG, and this has proven also a very interesting venue. It's called the Conference on Diplomacy and International Relations. Is that the correct? Yeah. And also modern technology, well, the information technology, I think, helps to take diplomacy into the house of the consumer, if we can put it that way, and a whole new generation of people becoming interested in foreign affairs. We have today YouTube access to, well, any of my presentations or speeches for one, but any other significant foreign policy initiative that the ministry may take. You have maybe our press officer here can even mention some of the other examples. YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, a website that is permanently being updated. So transparency has become really, we're working at an entirely different level than we were 10, 20 years ago. And I guess that falls under the heading also public diplomacy. There's outreach also to the public sector, the private sector, I mean. This has been increasing since some of the, well, I would say the Uruguay round maybe, large-scale trade negotiations. But today it's reaching an entirely new level to the point where some of our big private sector associations or chambers of commerce, and many of them, Tony, organize events with foreign leaders, and we are very often working out common agendas. Very recently, I was involved, for example, in a visit by the president of Uruguay to São Paulo, where he didn't even meet with any government official. It was essentially a private sector event. I was there, of course, participating and discussing ways of enhancing investment and trade with Uruguay and other forms of cooperation. So all these developments, I think, are very significant and are a sign of a trend that will only become more more visible in the coming years. And finally, there's a question about India. There's so much that we do with India these days that I am often on the phone with my counterparts. I've traveled to India recently for an IBSA ministerial, the India, Brazil, South Africa forum, where we had, among other things, a lengthy discussion on Libya. The three countries are also presently in the United Nations Security Council, which only opens up even other possibilities for coordination on a number of matters. Trade is perhaps not as significant or hasn't really reached the full potential that it might. There are historic reasons for this. There's transportation challenges to be overcome, maritime transport, air travel. The two societies, it's interesting because whereas the governments have worked together very closely in a number of multilateral fora, and of course you know this very well, whether it was GATT or the United Nations or on any of a number of international negotiations, the two societies don't really know each other very well. Many of you know how important telenovelas are in Brazil. And recently there was one that took place in India, and that was it really opened up the eyes of the population to, well, the beauty of the music and the dances and the textiles. So that was quite an interesting development in itself. But I think we need to do much more to bridge this kind of gap. Otherwise, I think India and Brazil probably are among the poles in the new multipolar world that have the most coincidental agendas. A little bit before I said that we're very transformational when we look at the international system or the multilateral system, and so is India. So we are partners with India in trying to reform the United Nations Security Council and ensuring that it is more representative of the current state of affairs, the current or contemporary geopolitical configuration. We have worked very closely under the G20 at the WTO. In fact, when it comes to agricultural negotiations, you will see the US, the European Union, Brazil, and India coordinating at the more restricted level. Of course, we always stay in touch with the other G20 members when we participate in those discussions. You see us coordinating as BRICS members on G20, financial G20 issues. Where you may find a difference, I think, is in the security challenges that the two countries face. Very different ones. India in a much more problematic region of the world than Brazil from that perspective. Afghanistan, Pakistan, these are all issues that the American public opinion is very familiar with and represent huge security challenges for India. India is prey to terrorism, which Brazil isn't. Explains to a large degree why India became a nuclear weapon power, which we do not intend to become. Otherwise, I see a really very promising future for India-Brazil relations. There's, in spite of the difference in culture, in spite of the fact that as societies we have only come in touch with each other relatively recent times, very easy to communicate between government officials, between Brazilian and Indian diplomats. It's quite extraordinary. And I often rely on the wisdom of my Indian colleagues and counterparts to look at a number of international issues. So,
do you want to continue? Or?
No, this is it.
Good. Okay. So
we could go on for another hour, but
okay. I would like to thank very much Foreign Minister Antonio Patriota for the privilege of having chosen the Wilson Center to make his first public presentation as Brazilian Foreign Minister here in the United States. I'd like to thank all of you, obviously Ambassador Tony Harrington, all of you for having coming, for being here with us. And now I would like to invite you to a reception just across the way when you have an opportunity to talk a little bit more with the foreign minister and with some of our guests, but you have to be fast and you have to leave right now. Thank you very much.
Bienvenido.